I'm here talking with Zorn about mastering, specifically mastering information that recording artists would like to know. So first of all, Zorn, is it necessary to master?
Jim, it absolutely is for recording artists who want to have their material played in public, on the radio, in clubs, on the internet. If they want their recordings to sound similar and compatible to other recordings that are played through those channels, they absolutely need to master it. Otherwise, the listener is going to have a surprise when their track comes up and it sounds either softer or differently colored, differently EQ'd than other tracks. That's not going to sound good. It's not going to make a good impression upon the listener. And if you're playing your recordings in your own room at your own leisure time, then it's okay, you don't need to master.
Okay. What about some mixing engineers that almost master during the mixdown, mainly by taking the output, the main stereo output, and either EQing it and or compressing it as a way to master it during mixdown? Is that a good idea?
I would absolutely discourage such a practice, and I would encourage artists to tell their mixing engineers not to use any global compression or EQing or limiting during the mixdown process, because at the time the mixing engineer is focusing on balancing the input tracks, giving them proper treatment, EQ, compression, enhancement, whatever. At that time they cannot be aware of the whole dynamics and the loudness of the stereo track, of the main bus. Especially those other tracks that they've mixed before that need to be made to sound similar in terms of spectrum, dynamics and loudness to every other track. They're simply not going to be able to deliver the correct and needed processing. So on top of that, the mixing engineer doesn't have nearly quite as wide a choice of plugins, units, or hardware processors that a mastering engineer has when they do mastering to process the final track in such a way that it preserves the dynamics, it preserves the liveliness, that it breathes properly, and so it's a musical process that rather than just a mathematical process. So mixing engineers often just slam limiting or compression over the mixing bus, or over the mix bus, stereo bus. And that way they squash the recording and make it very difficult, if not impossible, for mastering engineers to do their job.
So you would almost want to undo that to do your mastering job, but you can't.
Totally, yeah. It's a done deal. I mean, once it's over limited, over compressed, you just can't make it live again. It's dead by then. So I encourage all the recording artists to take charge and to demand from mixing engineers to give them an uncompressed on the bus and unequalized mixes. Of course they need to process all the tracks the way they need when they mix, you know, compress, EQ, enhance, but leave the mix bus uncompressed.
Okay. Any other tips for recording artists about what they can do to prepare things for mastering? Things like bit depth of resolution or sampling rate, anything along those lines?
Definitely. Let me first mention that the mix needs to be done well, needs to have a proper balance of all the instruments. Whatever the featured instruments are, those should be up front. You know, everything should have its proper treatment in the mix, like the way it should, and the artist should be happy with the mix by the time they take it, you know, and bring it to the mastering engineer. So not expect the master engineer to take care of the problems that were induced during the mixdown process. So the balance should be there. All the instruments within the mix should have their proper spectrum. Like the vocals should not be thin, they shouldn't be dull, they should have enough presence. And they should have not less of the high frequency content. It's a very often that problem comes up. Then other instruments, especially percussion, like tambourine, hi-hats, shakers, you know, instruments with high-end, a lot of high-end contact, like acoustic guitars played solo or strummed. So all of those things should be sort of mellower and high-end than the vocal is, so that the vocal, I'm assuming that it's featured, like every vocalist wants their voice to be very well heard and understood. So all of that should be in place. It should not be thin, so that when one tries to EQ the master in such a way to fatten up that vocal, so there aren't other things there that start to sound bad when they're equalized, like, you know, tubby guitars or tubby bass or whatever. So that's the easiest thing to do. That is during the mixdown. Have your vocal EQ'd in a way that it serves that instrument. That applies to every other instrument. So that's number one, the balance. Then the other thing, okay, if you're not sure, or if your mixing engineer is not experienced enough, then have him do the stems. Have him give the mastering engineer separate tracks that are important. Like, you can separate your vocal into a separate mono track, and then everything else should be on a pair of stereo tracks. That way, the mastering engineer can mix those in such a way that it serves the song. Or, okay, say you think, you know, a bass or kick or snare, whatever you think is important, you can put it on a separate track and then save that trouble. Save your mastering engineer that trouble, and in other, also ensure that your mix is going to sound right, it's going to sound full. So that's a trend that recently is very popular. A lot of mixing engineers, they give the artist separate tracks, and then they have the mastering engineer do the final mix and then the mastering. If you are happy with your mixing engineer, then by all means have it all done in a stereo file, and then the mastering engineer can just enhance that file and make it sound even better. Okay, that's that. And then please record in high resolution. Do not record in 16 bits. There's no excuse to recording 16 bits today when all the computers have much more power than even a few years ago.
So minimum 24 bits.
Yeah, 24-bit is enough. Like Pro Tools works in 24 bits. So does Logic. Cubase can work even in 32 bits. And if your computer has the muscle, by all means use that. The other thing is, use the higher sampling rate if you can have enough processing power. So if your computer can tolerate 96 kilohertz or 88.2, by all means use that. Then when the final track is mixed and mastered, and then dithered down to 44.1 16-bit, it's going to retain more of that definition than when it was recorded in 44.1 16.
Okay. Any other tips for recording artists to get their material ready for a mastering engineer?
Yeah, take full charge of your recording. Do not trust, I mean, by all means trust your engineers for the job they do, but be attentive and listen to the recording at all times during the whole process, and demand that your needs are met.
Thanks, Zoran.
Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you. Good luck.